Mr. Chairman, my legislation in the form of this amendment calls for a special counsel to investigate the real crimes, harmful lies, and the undermining of American security by the prior administration. Just because Hillary Clinton lost the last election doesn't mean we should forget or forgive conduct that is likely criminal. The 2016 election was a rule of law election. Voters want real criminals who have harmed our nation locked up. Susan Rice's unmasking of members of the Trump transition team is a serious matter for which there has been no accountability yet. Loretta Lynch directed James Comey to call the Clinton email scandal a matter and not an investigation. We need to know why the Attorney General of the United States directed the FBI director to lie to the American people. While on the subject of the improper conduct of Loretta Lynch, what in the world was she doing on a private jet at the Phoenix airport talking to Bill Clinton while she was supposed to be investigating his wife? This is somewhere on the continuum between unethical and illegal, and we need an investigation of Tarmac Gate. We need to know why the Obama administration gave immunity deals to potential Hillary Clinton co-conspirators. Think about that. Giving immunity to people who potentially worked with Hillary Clinton to break the law. Let's get to the bottom of the Clinton Foundation. Cash was flowing to the Clinton Foundation while the Uranium One deal was at work. That's real collusion that threatens America's security. I do suspect that there was Russia collusion in the 2016 election, but the only actual evidence of that collusion is tied to Fusion GPS, a company that was creating fake dossiers on then-candidate Trump and spreading them both before and after the election to undermine his legitimate presidency. Now, federal statute 600.1 outlines the criteria for special counsel. It says that there must be a conflict of interest or extraordinary circumstances, and that a special counsel must be in the public interest. The Department of Justice has an obvious conflict investigating the immediate past Attorney General and FBI Director. Currently, Department of Justice officials may have been involved in the very immunity deals or the implementation of Lynch or Comey directives that would need to be investigated. Moreover, these are extraordinary circumstances where the prior administration was prioritizing politics over the law. As for the public interest, if it's in the public interest to investigate the Trump administration, it is most certainly in the public interest to investigate the real crimes by the real criminals. Mr. Chairman, prior to proceeding, I would like to make a point of parliamentary inquiry and inquire as to the potential germanity of this amendment. Given the privileged nature of the resolution, I would yield to the chairman for a response.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I like the spirit of his amendment, and I think it is very well intentioned. However, counsel for the committee has consulted with the House parliamentarian and been advised that the amendment is not germane to the resolution. In consultation with the committee's parliamentarian, that is the same conclusion that we have reached, that it is not germane. I have, however, because I agree with the desire of the gentleman to see that these matters are properly investigated, I have prepared a very detailed letter that sets forth the basis for asking the Department of Justice to appoint a special counsel, and I would invite the gentleman to join me in signing that letter.
Reclaiming my time, therefore, Mr. Chairman, I agree. I will join you in signing a letter to call for a special counsel to investigate these potential crimes in the prior administration. And at this time, I'd like to withdraw the amendment, and I have another amendment at the
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman has another amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, can I just inquire about the
I'd like to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Not until the gentleman's time has expired, and he's going to introduce another amendment.
Expiring.
Well, we may give him more time.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to withdraw the first amendment.
No, the clerk will report the amendment.
I'm asking Mr. Gates, Mr. Chairman, not you. He has control of the time.
Let's report the amendment, and then you can ask him any question you want if he yields
That's what I'm
the
trying
time.
to avoid.
Mr. Chairman,
Point of parliamentary inquiry. Mr. Gates were to yield to me, can I offer my amendment?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I do not yield to Mr. Cicilline until I have the opportunity to offer my second amendment, at which point I'll be more than eager to yield to Mr. Cicilline.
Is his amendment?
Point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Is it not a Democrat's opportunity now to offer an amendment? You just had one, two from the Republicans.
it was
Aren't we
with-
entitled to offer an amendment?
It was withdrawn.
No, but you had your amendment, Mr. Chairman, and now he's offered an amendment. It's now opportunity for Democrats to offer an amendment.
The clerk will report the amendment of the gentleman.
Substitute for
Loretta.
the substitute for the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.Res. 446 offered by Mr. Gates of Florida. Strike all that follows after the resolving
Objection,
clause.
the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized on
I
his.
object.
Objection has been heard.
Could I ask for the whole amendment to be read, please, Mr. Chairman?
Shall we do it, or just? We'll do it. Why not? Let everybody read. Let's everybody hear.
Story
what we're
time at the
asking for.
Judiciary Committee.
The clerk will read the amendment.
That it is the sense of the House of Representatives that a special counsel should be appointed
Reserve a point of order.
by the Attorney General or his designee to investigate the following. Then Attorney General Loretta Lynch
I think.
directing
correct?
James B. Comey to mislead the American people by
Would
stating
will the
that
clerk suspend? The gentleman, is she reading the correct?
Mr. Chairman, am I recognized?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, the second amendment that I have begins that the President is requested and the Attorney General of the United States is
Clerk will
directed.
read, the clerk will read that amendment. Clerk will proceed.
that the President is requested and Attorney General of the United States is directed to transmit respectively in a manner appropriate to classified information if the President or Attorney General determines appropriate. To the House of Representatives, not later than 60 days after the date of the adoption of this resolution, copies of any document, record, audio recording, memo, correspondence, or other communication in their possessions, or any portion of any such communication that refers or relates to the firing of James B. Comey in the following respects. Then Attorney General Loretta Lynch directing James B. Comey to mislead the American people by stating that he should refer to the investigation.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the amendment be considered as read.
No, you're late. You object. Object.
What is the objection?
We want it read.
Yeah, great. Continue reading.
By stating that he should refer to the investigation into the mishandling of classified data and use of an unauthorized email server by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as a matter rather than a criminal investigation. Leaks by James B. Comey to Columbia University law professor Daniel Richmond regarding conversations had between President Donald Trump and then FBI Director James B. Comey, and how the leaked information was purposely released to lead to the appointment of a special counsel, Robert Mueller, a longtime friend of James Comey. The propriety and consequence of immunity deals given to possible Hillary Clinton co-conspirators, Cheryl Mills, Heather Samuelson, John Bentel, and potentially others.
Got it.
By the Federal Bureau of Investigation during the criminal investigation James B. Comey led into Hillary Clinton's misconduct. The decision by James B. Comey to usurp the authority of then Attorney General Loretta Lynch in his unusual announcement that criminal charges would not be brought against Hillary Clinton following her unlawful use of a private email server and mishandling of classified information. James B. Comey's knowledge and impressions of any ex parte conversation between then Attorney General Loretta Lynch and former President Bill Clinton on June 27, 2016 at a Phoenix airport on a private jet. James B. Comey's knowledge of the company Fusion GPS, including its creation of a dossier of information about Mr. Donald J. Trump, that dossier's commission and dissemination in the months before and after the 2016 presidential election, and the intelligence sources of Fusion GPS or any person or company working for Fusion GPS or its affiliates, any and all potential leaks originated by James B. Comey and provided to author Michael Schmidt dating back 1993. James B. Comey's knowledge of the purchase of a majority stake in the company Uranium One by the company Rosatom. whether the approval of the sale was connected to any donations made by the Clinton Foundation, what role then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton played in the approval of that sale, and whether the sale could have affected the national security of the United States of America. James B. Comey's refusal to investigate then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton regarding selling access to U.S. State Department through Clinton Foundation donations, Huma Abedin's dual employment at the State Department and the Clinton Foundation simultaneously, or utilization of the State Department to further paid speaking opportunities for her husband. Any collusion between former FBI Director James B. Comey and Special Counsel Robert Mueller, including the information James B. Comey admitted to leaking to the Columbia University law professor, being intentional such that a special counsel, his longtime friend Robert Mueller, would be appointed to lead the investigation against the Trump administration, and any communication between Robert Mueller and James B. Comey in advance of the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing, whether James B. Comey had any knowledge of efforts made by any federal agency to monitor communications of then-candidate Donald Trump, to assess any knowledge by James B. Comey about the unmasking of individuals on Donald Trump's campaign team, transition team, or both, to assess the role that former National Security Advisor Susan Rice played in the unmasking of these individuals, or to reveal the purpose served by unmasking any individual or individuals serving on the staff of then-candidate Donald Trump, or the dissemination of unredacted information to various intelligence agencies, and any attempts to use surveillance of then-candidate Donald Trump for the purposes of damaging the credibility of his campaign, his presidency, or both.
Does the gentlewoman from Washington seek to reserve a point of order?
Yes, I do.
A point of order has been reserved. The gentleman from Florida is recognized on his amendment.
I thank the chairman, and given the amendment's thorough reading, I doubt that a detailed explanation is necessary. I would yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island as I had promised, but I see he's stepped out for a moment, and so I yield. Oh, is he there? No? Very well. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentlewoman wish to be heard on her point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is not germane. First, it addresses an entirely different subject matter. The underlying resolution seeks information about the scope of the Attorney General's recusal, the President's decision to fire Director James Comey, and the President's claim that he recorded his conversations with Director Comey. These matters relate to current government officials and agencies that fall into our jurisdiction. The amendment, however, relates to a long list of former government officials. James Comey's current state of mind, his, quote, purpose for transmitting his notes to another private citizen, his current, again, quote, knowledge and impressions of any conversations between Attorney General Lynch and President Clinton, and his knowledge of Fusion GPS are entirely beyond the subject matter of this resolution and probably our jurisdiction as well. Second, Mr. Chairman, the amendment would render the resolution not privileged. Under House rules and precedents of this committee, that also makes the amendment not germane. In order to enjoy its privileged status, a resolution of inquiry must call for facts rather than opinions and cannot require the government to undertake a new investigation. We asked the House parliamentarian to review our resolution, and we worked with them to reach language that they believe meets both of those tests. This amendment that's offered here asks for opinions. For example, whether this sale could have affected the national security of the United States of America. And it requires the government to open several new investigations to determine James Comey's current state of mind, for example, and to root out a completely unsubstantiated theory that Mr. Comey and the special counsel are somehow in cahoots. And it asks for investigations, for example, any and all potential leaks by James Comey. This both changes the nature of the resolution and it breaks its privilege. In 1998, the chairman of this committee set a precedent, and I quote, to a privileged resolution of impeachment, an amendment proposing instead censure, which is not privileged, was held not germane. That precedent applies here. An amendment that makes the underlying privileged resolution not privileged is not germane. Nevertheless, Mr. Chairman, I am willing to withdraw my point of order if the sponsor of this amendment can agree to a friendly amendment in turn. My colleagues are as entitled to their oversight prerogatives as I am to mine. So if my colleagues are willing to add these points that are in your amendment to our resolution, rather than substitute your questions for ours, then I will withdraw my point of order, and I will look forward to their support for the underlying resolution.
Does the gentleman from Florida seek to be heard on the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll respectfully decline the gentlelady's offer. There is already a special counsel reviewing the conduct of the Trump administration. I think what the American people want to see, and what I suspect a majority of this committee will want to see, is ultimately evidence produced to us, and then the subsequent appointment of a special counsel to ensure that the real criminals are held accountable for their conduct that has undermined the country. I'll now speak to the specific germanity points, and I'd like to begin on the matter of privilege. My language only impacts those documents which currently exist, and so there is no requirement under the language that I have produced for a new investigation to be undertaken or for new documents to be generated. If there are not documents responsive to the request made, that will simply be the response that the committee receives, and thus the privilege is not impaired and the amendment would be germane. As to whether or not the amendment expands the scope of the matter at hand, the gentlelady from Washington's amendment seeks to find information regarding the firing of James Comey, and my substitute amendment seeks information regarding the firing of James Comey. We simply have a more detailed and I would say more focused approach to what might be those things that Mr. Comey was fired about. And what's interesting about Mr. Comey's service is that that service did not solely occur under the presidency of Donald Trump. Mr. Comey was director of the FBI under the prior administration. And Mr. Trump has publicly stated, I should say President Trump has publicly stated, that Mr. Comey was fired not just as a consequence of his conduct during the Trump administration, but as a consequence of his conduct under the Obama administration. This is not a view uniquely held by Mr. Trump. It's a view held by many Democrats, something that was certainly illuminated during the chairman's opening statement. And so if there is an amendment that seeks information regarding Mr. Comey's firing, it is entirely within the scope of that amendment to determine whether or not Mr. Comey's refusal to investigate the crimes of the Clinton Foundation, whether Mr. Comey's observance of the unmasking of members of the Trump transition team, whether Mr. Comey's potential participation or knowledge of the Fusion GPS matter, where there was active collusion with Russia to undermine Donald Trump both before and after he was sworn in as president. It is entirely within the scope. It is simply more focused, and I would say, Mr. Chairman, more in line with the views of the American people, and I would yield my remaining time. Very well, I yield back.
The chair is prepared to rule on the
Chairman.
point of order, and the chair
Mr. Chairman, on this point of order.
This is the chair is prepared to rule on the point of order. The
We
chair
want to
is
speak
prepared
to the point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Both sides have had the opportunity to present their arguments in the point of order, and the chair is prepared to rule. The chair has.
Parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his parliamentary inquiry.
Is it the intention of the chair to hide behind the procedure?
That is
cut
not
off
a
discussion of
the
the
gentleman's
propriety
inquiry
of
is
the motion?
not a parliamentary inquiry.
It certainly is.
No, it is not. The chair is prepared to rule. The counsel for the committee has consulted the parliamentarians on this amendment as well, and the parliamentarian has advised the committee, and the parliamentarian of the committee has advised the chair that this amendment is germane. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman. He hasn't ruled.
I've ruled that the amendment is germane.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman can be recognized on the amendment.
I move to appeal the ruling of the chair.
The ruling of the chair has been appealed.
Move to table it.
The appeal of the ruling of the chair has been tabled. The question is on the table of the ruling, of the appeal of the ruling of the chair. All those in favor of tabling respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Neither the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr.
and the
Chairman, I
appeal is ruled.
request a roll call
A
vote.
recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes yes. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Labrador? Mr. Farenthold?
Yes.
Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Mr. Collins? Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes yes. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford votes aye. Ms. Handel? Ms. Handel votes yes. Mr. Conyers?
No.
Mr. Conyers votes no. Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? No. Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
Very no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Deutsch? No. Mr. Deutsch votes no. Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Snyder? Mr. Snyder votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Gentleman from Idaho. Gentleman from Texas. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 17 members voted aye, 9 members voted no.
And the tabling of the appeal of the ruling of the chair is sustained. Who seeks recognition on the amendment? First, the gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment, obviously, because it hijacks the intent of the resolution of inquiry and goes into entirely different subjects. Now, I would not oppose. I mean, if you want to waste the committee's time, frankly, by pursuing right-wing conspiracy theories from the past, okay, as long as you also look at the questions raised in the resolution of inquiry. But instead, you're shutting off the subjects of the committee of the resolution of inquiry. Back in February, I introduced the first resolution of inquiry related to Russia's relationship with the Trump campaign and the Trump administration. At the time, the chairman told us that it was unnecessary, premature, and not the best way for this committee or the House to conduct oversight over the issues covered by the resolution. We were assured the committee would be conducting significant oversight over the Department of Justice, as well as Russia's interference in the U.S. election and the possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. But here we are 5 months later with what is potentially one of the greatest scandals in American history unfolding in front of our eyes, and this committee has so far remained silent. When Democrats first started raising questions about Russia, we were told by the White House, the Department of Justice, and by Republican members of Congress that there was nothing to the story. We were just conspiracy theorists disappointed with the outcome of the election. But each day we learn more information that only confirms our earlier suspicions and that raises yet more questions while this committee refuses to act. Just recently, Donald Trump Jr. published an email exchange showing that he actively solicited assistance to the Trump campaign from an unfriendly foreign government. And yet this committee has been silent. During his confirmation hearings, then Senator Sessions flatly denied having any contact with Russian officials. Then we learned that he had at least 2 meetings and possibly a third with the Russian ambassador. Then he told us that those meetings were simply in his capacity as a senator, and he certainly never discussed anything related to the Trump campaign. Now we know that this was false too. And yet, In the face of this ever-changing story from the Attorney General of the United States, this committee has been silent. Despite having recused himself from the Russia investigation, we learned that Attorney General Sessions was involved in the decision to fire former FBI Director James Comey, a decision the President himself said was because of, quote, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia. And yet, the committee has been silent. Being in the majority is about setting priorities for the committee. Unfortunately, last week, the majority showed us where their priorities lie. On Friday, every Republican member of this committee wrote to Attorney General Sessions to demand responses, not to any issue before us today, but to a number of letters they sent during the last administration. How does our majority choose to use its limited resources? On questions about a low-level fraud investigation submitted to the acting Associate AG in 2014, on a letter about a cross-border data flow submitted to the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General in 2015. But our responsibilities did not end on January 20, our oversight responsibilities did not end on January 20th. Perhaps Republicans longed for a simpler time when there was a different administration, when our biggest concern seemed to be Lois Lerner's emails, and when the prospects for stripping health care from millions of Americans to finance tax cuts for the rich were but a distant dream. It is deeply disappointing that the majority chooses to ignore world events, direct threats to the integrity of the Department of Justice, and the 4 letters that Democrats in this committee have now sent to the chairman calling for hearings on these matters. Rather than relitigate the past, we should pay attention to what is happening today. The resolution offered by the gentlelady from Washington did not seek information about last year's campaign or about the Russian government's actions to subvert our election process. The resolution deals with the functioning of the executive branch, the FBI, and the Department of Justice this year. Right now, the President is attacking and undermining the entire senior leadership of the Department of Justice, not to mention Special Counsel Mueller. This could be an attempt to lay the foundation of his own Saturday night massacre and to try to stop the investigation, the Russia investigation, from advancing. That makes it absolutely critical that we understand exactly how the Comey firing was handled and who was involved. The resolution of inquiry would do just that. The FBI and the Justice Department are at the heart of the jurisdiction of this committee. The firing of Mr. Comey, the recusal of Attorney General Sessions, the threats by the President aimed at Attorney General Sessions and at Special Counsel Mueller, the possible obstructions of justice and all this are all in the oversight jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee. Mr. Mueller's investigation of possible crimes does not, as the chairman said at an earlier hearing, that is, he said, I'm disagreeing with what he said, does not, as he said in an earlier hearing, relieve us of our oversight responsibilities over the Justice Department, the FBI, and our justice system in general. The House and Senate Intelligence Committees are investigating matters within their purview. The Senate Judiciary Committee has begun its own investigation of this matter. We are alone in our inaction, and there is no excuse for burying our heads in the sand at this critical moment. I urge the committee to take our oversight responsibilities seriously and to focus on the important issues at hand. This amended resolution deals entirely with the past, and as I said, if the committee wants to spend its time on that, fine, but we should not avoid the oversight responsibility for the attempted subversion of the Department of Justice now. I urge that we go back and take the original resolution favorably, whatever we do with the amended resolution now. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes himself in support of the amendment. I thank the gentleman from Florida for offering this amendment. I agree that many of the items listed in this amendment are things that this committee has great interest in. In fact, last Congress, we sent more than a dozen letters to the Obama Justice Department seeking information about the FBI investigation into Secretary Clinton and related matters. Our efforts were largely ignored by Attorney General Lynch. I share my colleagues' desire to determine to what extent the extent to which laws were broken during the election by individuals named in this amendment. We are all well aware, and this is a point my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do not seem to pick up on, there is already a special counsel investigation into the connections between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. As my colleagues no doubt know, the special counsel regulations require that there be grounds for a criminal investigation. What those grounds are with respect to the current administration is an open question. We simply do not know what Mr. Mueller is investigating or how broad his authority is. There is real concern that this is a fishing expedition. What we do know, however, is that Mr. Mueller's investigation is limited to matters involving the president's campaign. There is no mandate to look into any of the very real questions enumerated in this amendment. There has been no accountability. The previous administration was simply permitted to run out the clock. However, I believe strongly that we need these answers. Our constituents, the American people, deserve to know the facts, all of them surrounding the 2016 presidential election. However, the Attorney General has recused himself from matters related to the 2016 campaign, and the current special counsel investigation is insufficient to fully investigate those matters. Consequently, I support the gentleman's amendment as a way to ensure that this committee receives information it requested but was denied. I plan to make further inquiries to the Deputy Attorney General, specifically calling upon him to investigate matters related to the Clinton campaign, its ties to Russia, and the associated matters listed in this amendment, which establish the grounds for a criminal investigation. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the gentleman's amendment. Who seeks recognition?
Chairman,
First, the gentlewoman from Texas seeks
I
recognition.
rise to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I've indicated throughout the day that I do not attribute to my colleagues, albeit my vigorous disagreement with them, their right to express their views or their opinions, and I stand by that today. And I imagine that is the position that the gentleman from Florida is taking in the offering of this resolution. But it is nothing but a fishing expedition of old, dated, and already decided upon matters that rather than those of us on this side of the aisle being concerned about spilt milk, it is clearly a bucket of spilt milk. I would venture to say that there is not many constituents collectively across the United States that would be interviewed that would have any concern on what the gentleman has now asked about. None whatsoever. And certainly my good friends on the other side of the aisle had every opportunity to pass resolutions. They were in charge to hold hearings, and they did not. The gentlelady's underlying amendment is a thoughtful resolution of inquiry because it deals with the immediacy of what the American people are now concerned about. I would venture to say that if one went on the streets of rural America or urban America and asked the question about Russian collusion or the firing of James Comey or the issues that have been delineated in Ms. Jayapal's resolution, they would both understand and say, I think it is important that we move forward on getting those answers. The gentleman from Virginia, the chairman, indicated that it is very true that the special counsel's investigation deals with potential criminal prosecution. This committee has a responsibility for oversight into the actions of the Attorney General, which exploded upon us in the last 3 to 4 days, hearing that the Attorney General might have had discussions about the campaign with the ambassador to the United States from Russia. All of these point to the necessity of the very thoughtful resolution that asked the Department of Justice to provide information regarding the fire of Director James Comey, participation of Attorney General Sessions, the scope of the application of Attorney General Sessions' recusal, the application of Attorney General Sessions' recusal to the removal of Director Comey. These are legitimate current issues that need to be addressed. I would offer for 6 months we have watched the Trump administration make a mockery of our laws and the highest office in the land. This resolution will force Republicans to vote on production of evidence relevant to some of the most egregious actions that have been taken to date, if it had been addressed in a fair manner. The FBI's investigation into potential collusion between Trump and the campaign officials and Russian operatives is an important discussion, but information regarding the Attorney General's action is even more important as our responsibilities of oversight over the Department of Justice. I would offer to say, however, that in addition to asking constituents across America what they are most concerned is the orderly running of this country, they may also be familiar with Ike Kavalestes, if I'm pronouncing him right, a translator, Russian real estate individual, or Natalia, a Russian lawyer, or Jared Kushner, or Paul Manafort, or Renette Amashin, a Russian-American lobbyist, or Donald Trump Jr., all participants in a meeting that certainly had the ramifications of suggestion of talking about a campaign and colluding with Russia to undermine the 2016 election. Even separate and standing aside from this great resolution that we have, HRES 446, we've never answered those questions. And those questions are rising up among the minds of Americans. I'd venture to say that not many people are interested in tarmac visitations, unmasking that have already been answered, emails that have already been said there was nothing there, and a whole list of sore points of people who can't seem to get enough, of people who have served this nation, either former President William Jefferson Clinton or Secretary Clinton. I would venture to say that in this coming election, they will not be on the ballot. So to those who are indicating that we are sore losers, let me be very clear. Democrats did not suffer massive losses. Democrats gained House seats. Democrats gained Senate seats. And Democratic candidate for president won the popular vote by 3 million votes. The question has to be, how did they lose the election? And that is the issue undermining or underlying the resolution, is to get to the facts of firing and get to the facts of the issues dealing with Attorney General Sessions. How was the collusion between the Trump administration and campaign and the Russians to skew the election to one candidate over the other? And in this instance, it is the President of the United States. You don't want to answer those questions, so you offer a deja vu, already answered resolution that will now trump a reasonable, thoughtful resolution offered by the gentlelady from Washington, gentleman from Rhode Island, and thoughtful members of the United States Congress Judiciary Committee. It is a sad state of affairs and unfortunate that we find ourselves in this particular predicament. There lies the resolution that Mr. Cohen offered just a few days ago, and my resolution that I'm offering that has been introduced that I hope that maybe we can put on the agenda, that is to avoid or prevent the president from firing the special counsel or abusing the pardon power, HRES 474. Let's put that on the agenda and have a real debate. I yield back.
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. For purposes, the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition.
To strike the last word, Mr.
Gentleman is
Chairman.
recognized for 5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman, why would the Attorney General tell the FBI director to call the investigation a matter? Last time I checked, he's not director of the Federal Bureau of Matters. Why would the Attorney General meet with the subject of the investigation's husband 3 days before the subject of the investigation is to be interviewed by the FBI? Why would that happen? Maybe because they wanted Clinton to win the election, right? We got all these investigations about Putin's government trying to influence our election. How about the Obama administration's influence on our election? Think about this. You had the Attorney General of the United States tell the FBI Director of the United States, go tell the American public something that is not true. And he did it. He did it willfully. He did it intentionally. He did it at the direction of the United States Attorney General. This is the Judiciary Committee charged with defending the Constitution, and we have a Justice Department that knowingly, intentionally, willfully misled the American public in the middle of a campaign. And we're not going to ask for these documents, and we're not going to pass a resolution saying we need a special counsel. Are you kidding me? I mean, think about that. Our Justice Department not being square with the American people. Comey, it gets better. You can't make this up. It gets better. Comey gets fired. Then what's he do? He leaks a government memo through a friend to the New York Times, and he testified under oath. For what purpose did he do that? To create momentum for a special counsel to review and look at the Trump campaign and the Trump issues. Really? He did that? Leaked it? I mean, this is unbelievable. Through a friend, leaks a document to create momentum. I mean, it's not just any special counsel. It's his best friend. It's his predecessor. It's his mentor. It has to be Bob Mueller. That's where we're at. And we're not going to pass this resolution, and we're not going to call for a special. Are you kidding me? We have to do that. Think about the tarmac. I mean, I applaud the gentleman for bringing this resolution up, or bringing this amendment up to the resolution. One thing that we all know that drives our constituents crazy, drives Americans crazy, is this idea that there are now two standards of justice. One for us regular people, one for the folks we all get to represent, the 750,000 people in all our districts. But if your name's Comey, if your name's Lynch, if your name's Clinton, it's a whole different standard. This is the Judiciary Committee. This is important stuff. This is fundamental stuff. This is the kind of thing, exactly the kind of thing we should be focused on, exactly the kind of resolution we should pass, exactly the kind of resolution calling for a special counsel that should pass this committee with the letter and be supported by the full House of Representatives. That's the kind of message we need. That's what our constituents talk to us about every single day we're out in our districts talking with them. That's the kind of action that's needed. And again, I just applaud the gentleman from Florida for having the courage to do what our constituents have been asking us to do, the courage to do what this committee is supposed to be focused on doing. And I would urge everyone to vote yes on this.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the sponsor of the amendment.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentlelady from Texas said that the American people, they're not really worried about these things that we've discussed. They're not focused on things like the Clinton Foundation functionally selling access to the State Department. They're not worried about uranium reserves potentially changing hands in a mechanism that would hurt American security. They're not worried about unmasking. I would ask the gentleman from Ohio in his district, has he heard from individuals about those things, and what are his constituents saying about them? I yield back to the gentleman.
Yes. The simple answer is heck yes. And what they're also worried about is this double standard. It's supposed to be in this great country equal treatment under the law.
Would the gentleman yield?
Equal treatment under the law. That's all we're asking for. That's all we want to investigate. So let's do that.
Would the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from Texas is asked first. If I have time, I'll yield to the gentlelady as well.
And I would just like to applaud those comments and add, there's another name that needs investigation. The regulations are very clear. If there is a witness in an investigation that an attorney in the Justice Department is too close to, he must recuse himself. Bob Mueller is very close friends with Comey, so close Comey actually admitted that he colluded with Mueller about his testimony. What all did they collude about? I mean, did Comey actually do to Jeff Sessions? Did he encourage him to recuse himself the way he did John Ashcroft so he could get his child's godchild in to be special prosecutor back when he went after Scooter Libby? There are a lot of questions we need to know, and my time's expired.
Would the gentleman yield?
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Unfortunately, I have no time.
The gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition.
To strike the last word and express
Gentleman's recognized for
dismay
5
at
minutes.
what is occurring, this is the most astonishing moments I've ever experienced in my now 11th year in the Judiciary Committee. To take a question concerning the firing of the James Comey and turn it into a question about Hillary Clinton. This is unbelievable, sir. The chairman has left the room. Justice has left the room. Common sense has left the room. A lot has left this room, maybe never entered it. Now, I wanted to ask the chairman, he started off earlier by saying all the Republicans signed a letter and sent it to the Attorney General asking for answers to questions that were raised during the previous administration they never got answers to. I wanted to ask him if the issues in this particular resolution were in that letter. And if they were, they're being answered or not answered already. And I also wanted to ask him if he asked a single Democrat to sign on to that letter, because he certainly didn't ask me, and he didn't ask any of the Democrats I've asked. Why is he sending a letter as chairman of the committee without asking all members of the committee to join in? He's making it strictly, totally partisan. And by taking this over, Ms. Jayapal had already said she'd be happy to have Mr. Gates's issues included in her resolution so we could ask the Attorney General to answer all these issues, all these questions. That's what's fair. If you want to answer those questions, I wasn't wild about uranium and giving it up and whatever happened. I thought there were some issues about the foundation and the Secretary of State's office. I don't have a problem with those issues being answered, but I think Ms. Jayapal, who started it, should have her questions answered too. And that's only fair, not to take over and hijack her resolution to put out some issues that probably were encompassed in the chairman's letter. But what's fair would be to have all the questions asked for and ask the Attorney General to look into them. You know, the question was asked about, oh, they talk about Russia, but did the Obama administration get involved in this election? There's a big, big difference between Obama getting involved in the election, a partisan election, and helping somebody who was part of his administration run for office, and the Russians and Putin getting involved. Y'all get it totally wrong. It's not about somebody getting involved in the election. When Americans get involved in the election, it's okay. When Russia gets involved, we need to be united and be against that. Russia and Putin have
the
no
gentleman
business
yield?
being involved. No, sir, I won't. Russia and Putin have no right getting involved in our elections, never have. This should be bipartisan, and we should be together on this. Instead, we are divided, and we're bringing up issues from the past election. We need to get answers. America does not need to have Moscow give its imprimatur to actions. There is something afoul in the White House when the President of the United States goes up to Putin and says, "I'm honored to meet you." The mayor of Chicago never went up to Al Capone and said, "I'm honored to meet you." It's in essence the same thing. He is a thug.
Just a question.
No, I don't yield.
Just a question.
Once KGB, always KGB. And you're not honored to meet the man who was the KGB and still is the KGB and who murders his opponents and who gets them wiped out, puts them in jail so they're not eligible to run against him. And the idea of having a joint kumbaya committee to look into election fraud is absurd. They don't have elections in Russia. They kill or imprison their opponents, and they count the votes. It's not the same.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
There was a question about the FBI standard. All Republicans signed that letter, and then the chairman said something about this is using taxpayer dollars. Taxpayer dollars, this doesn't probably cost what it cost us to put up 10 people at Mar-a-Lago at government expense when he goes down there. He goes to Ohio the other day, and he says, "Oh, it's great to be here out of the swamp. I love it." Well, when he's not in Washington at the swamp, he's at the people that own the swamp's home at Mar-a-Lago. He doesn't know the swamp. He is the swamp. And the fact is, this country is being run into the ground.
Gentlemen will suspend.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman's words, if they haven't already crossed the line, I think are very close to it. So I would urge the gentleman to consider his remarks before he makes any further remarks.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. It's very difficult with our rules about not saying things about the president and speaking the truth and asking about the truth. And it's a hard place. Truth is a defense and libel action, but I'm not sure what the situation is here. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is recognized for 5 minutes.
And move straight to the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I support the Gates amendment. I'm very pleased to do so. I think it's on the right track. It is what we should have been doing. And I want you to know, in my district, my constituents say, "Hey, what's going on? What is going on with the investigation of the crimes of the previous administration?" They want justice. They want the rule of law. And what I just heard is a denial of the fact that an investigation is already going on to all the issues that the gentleman just talked about with regard to this administration. But what I heard previously from people today is, "Oh, this is old. The things in this the Gates Amendment are dated. They were decided upon. It's deja vu. Already answered. Let's not relitigate the past." That's what was said. But the reality, these things were never litigated. That rationale would be, if you take anything that happened in the previous administration, we're not concerned about that. We're not going to worry about that. That rationale basically says, let's not look back unless it's convenient for us on a partisan basis. Well, the reality is, I'm going to give you some examples from the amendment of things that were not looked back at, that need to be looked at, and we need the documents. And that's whether James Comey had any knowledge of efforts made to monitor communications of then-candidate Donald Trump. There's been numerous news reports indicating that that was the case. To assess any knowledge by Mr. Comey about the unmasking of individuals on the Trump campaign. That's a crime. Unmasking is a crime. And to assess the role that former NSA National Security Advisor Susan Rice played in the unmasking of these individuals. That's real. That is something that needs to be looked at. To reveal the purpose served by unmasking any individual or individuals serving on the staff of then-candidate Donald Trump. Those are not old, dated, decided upon, deja vu, already answered. Those need to be answered. I commend my friend from Florida for this amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
And no, I won't. When I hear talk about this contains right-wing conspiracy theories, well, I'm telling you, my constituents, and reference made to what do your constituents think, my constituents think what's going on in the underlying bill that was introduced today, the resolution introduced today, they think that's left-wing conspiracy theories. There's no doubt about it. This is a divided nation. But the reality is, you don't get there by not seeking the rule of law and seeking justice.
Would the gentleman now yield?
In my opinion, that is exactly what this Gates Amendment is all about. And with that,
Would the
Mr.
gentleman now
Chairman,
yield?
I yield back to the chair.
Thank you.
The gentleman yielded back. Does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, I move to strike the...
Yes, I just want to point out,
From New York is
I
recognized.
just want to point out in one or two sentences, unmasking is not a crime. It is a procedure done pursuant to Section 702 of the FISA Act, and may be appropriate in certain circumstances, and may not be appropriate. But to say that it's a crime is simply wrong. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate being recognized on this issue. And it really is amazing to hear the hyperbole that, and actually nobody better perfected the, oh, and was I only recognized for a minute and a half? Oh, here we go.
The clerk is working on the clock. The
All right,
gentleman
thank
will
you.
proceed.
But the Clinton administration perfected the defense of this is old news after years and years of obfuscating, refusing to produce evidence, and the Obama administration did not miss any of those tactics. We still don't have documentation on Fast and Furious, and we know we lost a precious U.S. agent's life because of that. The things that I asked for, the documents that were provided to the convicted terrorists in the Holy Land Foundation trial, never produced. And the Attorney General Holder had the nerve to say, well, you know, there may be classifications issues. I said, you provided it to the terrorists. Don't you think you could provide it to Congress? And obviously his response by his actions was no. He will not provide documentation to Congress that he provided to convicted terrorists. With regard to Putin and honored to meet you, I would just rhetorically ask, compare honored to meet you to a president sending over a Secretary of State after Russia attacks Georgia and the Bush administration gets so upset they put sanctions in place to send a message to Putin, we're not putting up with this type of attack on a neighboring country. So what did we do? The new administration, Obama, sends the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, over with a red button with a misinterpreted Russian translation. They want to reset relations with Russia. Clearly the message that Obama and Clinton sent to Putin, this person that's now being vilified by the people that did everything they could to suck up to the guy. They say, look, we want you to know we weren't really bothered by your attack on Georgia. We want to reset things. You know, Bush just overreacted. So we're good with what you do, which is clearly a message. We're good with you attacking Georgia. And to double down on that message, the Obama administration did the most double-crossing, dirty deal to allies of the United States, Polish elected officials, put their political careers on the line to protect Poland and the United States by allowing us to put missile defense system against Russia in Poland. What does Obama do? He does the ultimate gift to Obama for nothing in return, stabs our allies in the back in Poland, and withdraws that defense system. We're not going to put it in place. Didn't get anything in return. And what does he ask in return from Putin? Well, at another opportunity, he says, be sure and tell Vladimir I'll have a lot more flexibility, in effect, to give away more of America's protection and Western Europe's protection after my election. And people have the nerve to point the finger at the Trump administration. And it seems like the more, I know that there's allegation of old news, but the more we find out, the more is really new news. First, we have all these screaming and hollering about Donald Trump Jr. meeting with this Natalia Velenetskaya. And then we find out, actually, she should not have been in this country but for the Obama administration interceding so she could have this meeting, apparently, with Donald Trump Jr. Nothing came out of the meeting worthwhile. That's why he left early, and he got an apology for a worthless meeting. But it wasn't so worthless because Donald Trump Jr. met with this person affiliated with Fusion GPS, the Democratic opposition research firm, and with very notorious characters in Russia, then that was a big help to the Obama administration finally getting a warrant from the FISA court after they turned it down the first time. Now they get a warrant to bug the Trump Tower. This is stuff, the more we find out, the more it smells from the Obama administration, and we need the new news, the real motivation behind what's been going on, and the obfuscation from the other side. It's time to get to the bottom of this. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. For what purposes does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm alarmed that after 16 intelligence agencies have concluded that Russia tried to influence the outcome of the presidential election, and this House Judiciary Committee having had not one hearing to oversee the administration at this time when there are many questions arising about whether or not they have tried to obstruct the investigation that is ongoing. At this point, it forces Ms. Jayapal to introduce a resolution of inquiry, and when we have a hearing on that, the first thing that happens is the Republicans try to undermine that resolution by introducing this amendment. And it appears to me that House Republicans are colluding with the Trump administration to obstruct the investigation of the special counsel into allegations of the Trump campaign's collusion with the Russians and allegations that President Trump attempted to cover up and obstruct that investigation. 44 years ago, we had a House Judiciary Committee that rose above partisanship and protected our democracy from a constitutional crisis by oversight investigations that led to the impeachment and resignation of President Richard Nixon, resulting from his obstruction and cover-up of the Watergate break-in. Today, sadly, we have a House Judiciary Committee that colludes with an abusive and perhaps treasonous administration by refusing to provide a check on executive overreach by exercising its constitutional duty and responsibility to provide oversight. It's deeply disappointing, and it's indeed an alarming day.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that the gentleman's words be taken down, accusing us of treason and colluding.
Gentleman will suspend. Yes. The clerk will review the words, read the words back. What'd you say? Does the gentleman have the capability to read back the gentleman's words? My recollection of what the gentleman said was that the accusation that this side is colluding with a possibly treasonous administration, is that the...
The word wasn't possibly treasonous.
Yes, the word was is colluding with an abusive and perhaps treasonous administration by refusing to provide a check on executive overreach, by exercising its constitutional duty and responsibility to provide oversight.
Request a ruling of the chair.
Good job.
The chair is being advised that the words are too general to be directed specifically at a party or entity, and therefore are not out of bounds. The chair would also note that the gentleman is very close, so the chair would advise the gentleman to be very careful.
I was very careful with how I worded my comments, and I will repeat them again.
The chair would advise the gentleman to try to be more careful because the gentleman is very close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American people should be concerned about the direction that this country is headed in under Republican Party, unified Republican Party control. Republicans in control of this committee are perhaps complicit in peddling fake news and alternative facts to the American people. Anything to distract people's attention away from the investigation into possible collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign. Republicans on this committee conducted vigorous oversight of the Obama administration. Benghazi, Fast and Furious, the IRS with Lois Lerner and trying to impeach the IRS commissioner, and on and on. And today, we want to reopen the investigation into Benghazi. Well, this is Benghazi. This is the special committee. This is the special committee report. All 11 volumes on Benghazi. It's been beaten like a dead horse. This is oversight, but this Congress is refusing to do oversight. It's very disappointing. Today, I guess we'll probably hear from the other side that they want us to investigate, they want us to support their move to investigate Pizzagate, the child molestation conspiracy that caused a gentleman to drive all the way from South Carolina up to Washington, D.C., and take hostages or take a restaurant hostage and fire his weapon, thinking that there was a real conspiracy. That's the danger that we are confronting with leaders of America peddling fake news and alternative facts, knowing that it's not true. I'm really concerned about the direction of this country under this leadership. We're not doing the right thing by way of the American people. And I'm heartened to know that it was not a majority of the people in this country that elected this Congress and this administration. It was a minority of people who selected this current regime. And it's leading America to dark places. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
To strike the last comments.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to thank my colleague from Florida for having brought this resolution forward. You know, in the past, we had the great privilege of working together. He was in the Florida legislature, and I was a lifelong law enforcement officer, and we had the great privilege of working together to fight against injustice in our state. And I'm very proud to support him in this resolution here today because, again, I think there's been a great injustice in our country. I have to tell you, Mr. Chairman, when I was in law enforcement, I was a very ardent supporter of FBI Director James Comey. In fact, when he was appointed to look into the email scandal concerning campaign president Hillary Clinton, it was, I told folks that I was confident that he would get to the bottom of exactly what had happened in regards to those emails. And I felt from some of the evidence that had been presented that he would absolutely do an excellent job, as I'd always known him to do. However, I have to say, after listening to his press conference, Mr. Comey conducted a press conference for almost 30, 45 minutes back in July of 2016, and during that time laid out what I know to be probable cause for, and certainly a more in-depth investigation into the Clinton email, possible conspiracy involving these emails. And I wondered also about the propriety and the consequences of the immunity deals that he had given, his office had given to potential Hillary Clinton co-conspirators, Cheryl Mills, Heather Samuelson, John Bentel, and possibly others. And I have to tell you, Mr. Chairman, it was at the end of that when he then usurped the authority of then Attorney General Loretta Lynch, completely getting out of his law enforcement lane and saying that there would be no criminal prosecution or charges brought. I have to tell you, I was personally let down by that performance of the FBI director. So I think this is now the time, Mr. Chairman, that we need to come together and have a full disclosure of the issues that are so clearly laid out in this resolution. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purposes, gentlelady, seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, when I introduced this resolution, I thought we would have a discussion on the resolution. When the other side introduced essentially a resolution or an amendment that would gut my resolution and tried to focus it on an entirely different set of questions, I offered a friendly amendment to say, I'm happy to include your questions because I think you have a right to those answers. I don't think there's anything there, but how do I know that unless we have those questions answered? You chose not to accept that, and so I really reject any idea that somehow we're avoiding things and you are that you want to discuss. We have agreed to include those questions in our resolution, create one resolution that answers your questions and answers my questions. I think we have a right to that. I think that's what's fair. And in the absence of doing that, what it seems to me is happening, Mr. Chairman, is that there is deliberate stonewalling that appears to be happening to stop any movement into the questions that are before us today. Very serious and grave constitutional questions. And if you look at some of the things that have been emerging, this isn't just Democrats who are saying this. It would be one thing if you could say that it was only Democrats who raise questions about the things that are happening. That is not what's happening. And I wonder if you're questioning the credibility of the Senate Judiciary Committee in raising these questions, in calling before the committee Donald Trump Jr. and Comey and all of these people to hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee because they know that it is their responsibility to the country and to the Constitution and to our democracy to examine those questions. Because I don't think that Chairman Grassley or people in the Republicans in the Senate who are investigating this think it's ridiculous. They are investigating it because it is the responsibility to do so because increasingly troubling things are occurring. When Donald Trump Jr. has a meeting purportedly to get information provided by the Russians around the campaign and Hillary Clinton's the presidential campaign, and when following the revelation of that meeting, the president tweets his support for his son, doesn't even ask any questions, but says, this was his July 11th tweet, "My son Donald will be interviewed by Sean Hannity tonight. He's a great person who loves our country." July 13th, "My son Donald did a good job last night. He was open, transparent, and innocent. This is the greatest witch hunt in political history." But for the other side to imply that somehow Donald Trump Jr. is okay because he left the meeting because there was nothing worthwhile there, what does that mean? If there was information that was presented by the Russians that somehow would have been worthwhile and then he would have stayed? The reality is he should never have taken the meeting. And again, it's not just Democrats who are saying this. David French from the National Review, respected conservative, wrote an article saying, no, you don't take the meeting. You don't take the meeting. And when this committee and my friends on the other side undermine Mueller, Robert Mueller, as somehow also being partisan, I find that incredibly disrespectful to Mr. Mueller. In fact, when Mr. Mueller was selected as the independent counsel, there was wide bipartisan agreement. Mr. Mueller was the longest-serving FBI director since J. Edgar Hoover, originally an appointee of President George W. Bush in 2001. And yet now, because Mr. Mueller is uncovering things that must be investigated, like obstruction of justice by the president, all of a sudden, some of my Republican colleagues seem to be implying, and the president is certainly implying, that he doesn't need to be, that he is going to be fired from that role. And that is the problem with the special counsel role, is that it reports to the chain of command. And Representative Jason Chaffetz called Mueller a great selection with impeccable credentials. Charles Grassley said the same thing. Many Republicans have said that. So the reality is, Mr. Chairman, that I'm distressed that this committee cannot, on a bipartisan basis, agree that there are significant questions before the American people. You want to have another beating of the dead horse of Hillary Clinton and her emails? Fine, I'll include it. But let me and let us and let the American people have the opportunity to actually debate the issues that are before us today that Democrats and Republicans in the Senate have agreed are important to come before the Judiciary Committee. But this committee of the House Judiciary has yet to have a single hearing and, in fact, has stripped my resolution.
Time has expired.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will yield back, but I want to say that I will introduce the resolution again because I intend to have a discussion on the resolution.
The gentlelady's
Thank you,
time
Mr.
has
Chairman.
expired. The gentleman from Iowa, for what purpose, gentleman from Iowa?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to this debate, it strikes me that there's a few things that have been left out of this discussion, and I do support the gentleman from Florida's amendment, and I follow the ideology of this in the process. One of the things I would say to that is that as I listened to the gentleman from Tennessee address this subject matter and raise his voice pretty strongly about the allegations of Obama versus Russians versus Putin, I would make a couple of points on this. One is, it's pretty clear that the Obama administration sent their people over to Israel to work against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, pretty much openly. Significant dollars invested in that campaign over there. The President of the United States, with at least the moral support of the people that had worked for him in the country of Israel, seeking to shift the results of the election against the seated Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu. Then the gentleman, no, I won't yield. I have a lot of things I must say, but thank you. Then the gentleman did object to U.S. tax dollars being used. I just came back not that long ago from the Balkans, where I sat in a place like Macedonia. And there I learned that the United States government, borrowing money from China and Saudi Arabia, had handed over somewhere at least $5 million in contracts transferred through USAID into George Soros organizations that were used to manipulate elections in the Balkans. And that's just particularly Macedonia, not including the neighboring countries that are there. And some of that money was used to translate Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals into Macedonians to distribute the books, and the rules for radicals, and the actions of radicals were manifested within the election efforts in that part of the world. So I would say that the Obama administration is a long ways from clean on this as far as being involved in elections in other countries, not to mention little comments like the British, if you vote Brexit, you're going to have to go to the back of the queue. So that's the taxpayer dollars piece of this. But the long string that we should be looking at with this investigation and special counsel that is our request here, it goes a long ways back. It goes clear back to Huma Abedin, Anthony Weiner, 650,000 emails, which we still have access to. And the question that was answered to us by James Comey, which is there was nothing to see there. We did a fast software search of 650,000 emails, and in the case of Huma Abedin and Anthony Weiner sharing laptop and sharing emails, there was nothing new in 650,000 emails. And what we've done in this Congress so far is just taken his word for that. Now, it seemed fairly logical to take his word at the time until you examine the investigation that he conducted of Hillary Clinton. Oh, by the way, it was a matter. The investigation that had Cheryl Mills, her chief of staff, as her chief counsel in the room with Hillary Clinton, and both of them had a plea bargain of some kind. They were exempted from prosecution for some by limited terms, but in any case, when you have this chief of staff who's a subject of investigation too, they're as counsel to the person who is the subject of the investigation, and we ask under oath, and I ask these questions of Comey, or of Loretta Lynch and Comey under oath, and that is, where's the copy of the transcript? Where's the audio files? Where's the video files? Who was in the room? We don't have the answers to any of that except no. If there were notes taken, we don't know whose they are or where they are. If there was any transcript of the deposition, then that doesn't exist either. Neither do the tapes of either audio or video. This is what looks like on its face is a sham investigation. Plus, they destroyed a tremendous amount of information, at least 30,000 emails, crushed hard drives, bought bleach bit, hired outside contractors to scrub the emails up, and we're to take James Comey's word for this, that there wasn't enough substance there to bring a prosecution, even though on a year ago, July 5th, James Comey delivered 15 minutes of the summary of a prosecution that was completely convincing to me, until they got down to the last couple sentences of that presentation, which is, well, we can't prove intent. Well, curiously, there's no requirement for intent in the two statutes that appear to have been violated. And furthermore, I look back in the records to the previous October and the previous April, Barack Obama stated into the news media record, he said Hillary Clinton would never intend to put our national security at risk. Hillary Clinton would never intend to harm America's security. That's October and April, the previous October and April. Well, James Comey latched onto that word intend, and they made up new law and gave Hillary Clinton an exemption for this lack of intent that they said they couldn't prove, which is absolutely proven by the facts that he delivered to us in the summary that day, and that there is evidence for. And I would go on. And not only does this trail lead through Hillary Clinton and James Comey, but the Loretta Lynch component of this as well. When you put this in place and you look at the example of them on the tarmac, it's hard to imagine they sat there for 38 minutes and discussed grandchildren. I think that might even be singular, grandchild at the time. We should check that. But the answers that we got from Loretta Lynch were far less than satisfying. And then that brings me to Alexandra Chalupa, who went off she's a DNC contractor that went off over to Ukraine to try to gather dirt on the Trump people. So bringing this around, Mr. Chairman, I'll conclude it with this, as my time will soon run out, and that is this, that the trail leads, I believe, also to Barack Obama. We need to investigate all of this.
The gentleman's time has
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time suspended. Does any other member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Illinois, for what purposes?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, it is clear to me that some people watch Fox News and actually believe what they see on Fox News. It's clear. And this is another episode of the unbelievable that will be shown on Fox News. And tomorrow, Hannity will have a good time. He'll put you all have audition for Fox News tonight. You know what? They might send you all a check, too. Because clearly this is what this is all about, is to feed a false narrative to people. I watched Fox News this morning. They went out, what you think about Trump's speech? Did you really think they were going to say something bad? Have you ever heard anybody say anything bad about the President of the United States and Fox and Friends in the morning? No. I don't have anything
Will
bad
the
to say.
gentleman yield?
No. Absolutely not. Absolutely.
almost
Fox and
on a
Friends
daily
has all
basis.
they need already. So the difference is that you watch it, you believe it, and then you say, let me continue to entertain the notion that we are not in a crisis in America. I mean, think about it one moment. At least we got to give Grassley, the senator, credit, and the senators. They're not over there denying the reality of what is going on. You know, we have men and women in the intelligence services of the United States of America that I have learned from the Republican majority risk their lives every day to keep us safe. And what do? You squander their work. You squander their heroism. You squander their patriotism coming here and not dealing with the reality of what we're confronting as a nation. I mean, does anybody really believe that it would take a nanosecond if then President Barack Obama would have sent a note, a text? Well, what do? Tell me what does the president do? I don't do that thing. Tweet. Now, here it is, the President of the United States sends a tweet that says, how come the Attorney General of the United States, who I appointed, isn't investigating Hillary Clinton and locking her up? Which he was very good at saying during the campaign, the Attorney General of the United States. But I don't know how long he's going to be Attorney General because it looks like Trump, he hires and fires at will. He got rid of Comey. He's going to get rid of the Attorney General. Then he's going to get rid of Mueller. And this committee will still not take its job seriously. But going back to this, I want to just think a moment. He said, how long would it have taken for this committee if President Barack Obama would have tweeted to Eric Holder, why aren't you investigating my opponent in the past election and locking him up? How long do you think? A nanosecond before we would come here and there would be impeachment. I mean, we had impeachment here over a past president of the United States because he had sex. That's what it was really all about. And the interesting thing was, he was being impeached and voting by impeachment by people who had done exactly what they were accusing him of doing. I would have thought they would have resigned first from their positions before they would have taken on an impeachment of the president. Now, anybody could take down my word if what I'm saying is wrong, but it seems to me, I recall that the chairman of the Judiciary Committee had some outstanding pictures of beautiful women on his lap, but that was okay. Let's impeach the president. But when it comes to somebody circumventing the Constitution of the United States, the majority doesn't find any reason that we should call. Grassley does, the Senate does. Why do you think we're held in such low esteem? Because we don't do our job. Because we don't fulfill our constitutional commitment to safeguard the Constitution of the United States. This president is a threat to this nation, to its Constitution, to its democracy, and we are doing absolutely nothing to respond. Except, let's go back to talk about Hillary Clinton's emails. Hillary Clinton lost the campaign. You've already demonized her enough. Let's get on with the real business that we have before us. We have a president of the United States that is talking about forgiving and pardoning his children and his cabinet and himself. And he already fired the FBI director. He already is trying to figure out if he can fire Mueller. This is the greatest threat I have seen to our democratic institution and to our Constitution, and what we are doing is laughable. All due respect to Fox News and Friends and the Fox News Network, they don't need us to be subsidizing their television newscast.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Thank the chair.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. The issue about Russia, which we hear every day, and all of my days as a judge in Texas, I never heard the word collusion. I don't see that in our statutes. Conspiracy is a different word, but collusion is not a crime as far as I know. Be that as it may, in all fairness, I think that we should have an open investigation to all of these matters that have been discussed today. And I think that's been obvious by the statements that have been said by both sides. Let's talk about Comey. He is supposed to be, or was, the head of the most prestigious law enforcement investigation unit in the world, the FBI. And I've always held the FBI in high regard. So what happens? The investigation in our system is done by the police, as I call it. The prosecution is done by the attorney general or the district attorney or the county attorney. And in almost all cases, the investigator investigates, gets the information, and turns it over to those that will prosecute the case and let them decide whether to prosecute or whether not to prosecute. We had, in this case, the most unbelievable, unique experience where the investigator denied the Attorney General the ability to prosecute the case by holding a press conference and stating the facts, some of the facts, and then saying no reasonable prosecutor would ever prosecute this case, thus poisoning the case against Hillary Clinton because she could not be prosecuted after that. The Attorney General wouldn't prosecute her. Now, I was a prosecutor for 8 years, and I saw plenty of evidence there. There's a lot of juries in Texas that were convicted on that evidence if they'd have been shown that evidence, but that is a different issue. So then he holds another press conference saying, oh, I was wrong. There is evidence to prosecute Hillary Clinton. And then thirdly, the evidence, or he states that we will go with the first argument, there is no evidence. Totally improper for Mr. Comey, the head of the greatest law enforcement agency in the world, to hold these press conferences. Now, the issue is about the firing of Mr. Comey. That is one of the issues that the other side has brought up. Let's discuss his firing. Well, reasons for his firing go all the way back to last year under the Obama administration. And that is something that needs to be investigated. What was Comey's relationship with the last administration, with the Attorney General in the last administration, and about prosecuting or not prosecuting Hillary Clinton for things that a lot of Americans are still talking about? Now, the other side says, oh, she lost the election, forgive her of her potential sins as a candidate. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. The law does not work that way. If crimes have been committed, and I'm not saying they have been, but if they were committed, they still should be investigated. And if they weren't, that should be investigated as well to clear the air. But the idea that Mr. Comey can get a pass from being investigated because he was in the last administration is an unreasonable thought. So if we want to investigate him, investigate all of his absurd actions, including the fact that while he was no longer with the FBI, a private citizen, he is releasing information that belongs to law enforcement in an investigation. Law enforcement agencies don't have that ability. For a police officer, a former retired police officer, to pull out an offense report of a case that happened when he may or may not have been there and give that access to the public. That at least violates procedure of the FBI to release that unauthorized information because he was then a private citizen. He releases it to his friend releases it to the press, leave the press out of this issue. The issue is whether he was authorized as a private citizen. So there is a lot to be discussed about Mr. Comey and his actions. And I think that we should proceed on the investigation of Mr. Comey's firing and the reasons he was fired, because that is what we're supposed to do. And I will not go into some of the other matters discussed because we're out of time, but I'll yield the other 10 seconds to the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I just had a,
Minus 20 seconds. But
just had a question for the chairman. The chairman in his opening remarks mentioned a letter that he's prepared to put together and send. The magnitude of this situation in my mind would warrant that letter go today. Is that the plan of the chairman?
I want to afford all the members the opportunity to sign it, but it is available, and people are already signing it now, so I
would encourage members to do that, and we can send that as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You've been recognized. Yes, you have.
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
I was recognized for 5 minutes.
I had to step away for a few moments, and I came back, and I feel like I'm in a Midsummer Night's Dream here. There's some extraordinary comments on the floor, and if I could just try to reframe the context a bit. 17 of America's intelligence agencies reported to us with a high degree of certainty that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government engaged in a campaign to subvert and undermine the presidential election in the United States in 2016. And if there's anyone on either side of the aisle who wants to dispute that conclusion and finding, I will gladly yield some of my precious 4 minutes and 12 seconds remaining to hear if anybody rejects the conclusion of our intelligence agencies. Okay, so that's a fact that we all accept about the world now. And it is pervasively accepted because it's true. And nobody wants to dispute it.
Would the gentleman yield for a second?
Yes.
Does the gentleman accept the fact that the Attorney General of the United States instructed the FBI Director of the United States to tell the American citizenry something that was not in fact true?
Well,
accept that fact, because Mr. Comey testified to that.
Let's deal with that on your time if we could. I want to stay on course for what I'm talking about here, which is our intelligence agencies have told us definitively that there was a Russian effort to undermine and thwart our democratic process in 2016. I think that any constitutional patriot in America would consider this an emergency situation, that we have foreign powers trying to disrupt American elections. It's not a partisan issue. It's not Democrat. It's not Republican, liberal, conservative. It's an assault on the sovereignty of the American people that took place.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I would.
Has the Russian government has been interfering with our elections for years? Why didn't you have a concern about it when they interfered 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago?
Reclaiming my time. I entered Congress in January of this year. So
but
you
your
perhaps
party
were in
has
Congress
not-
before
your
me.
party has
I'm
not
reclaiming
been
my time,
concerned
Mr. Chairman. I'm reclaiming my time.
The gentleman from Maryland controls the time.
So we have in the White House a president who appears to be a master of deflection, diversion, and distraction. And now we're all running on a wild goose chase. We want to indict Mr. Comey. We want to go after everybody except for what is actually the subject of the investigation, which is what we need to know, which is how was our election impaired and tampered with in that way? That is the proper subject of our inquiry here. Now, I understand that the author of the amendment, the gentlewoman from Washington State, has said that she would gladly incorporate all of the inquiries that were suggested as a substitute to her amendment and to combine them together. And I hear my good friend and colleague from Texas, Judge Rowe, say that what we need is an open, comprehensive investigation, which is what some of us have been calling for from the beginning, not controlled by one side or the other, an independent 9/11 style outside investigation. And I would gladly work with him on legislation to do that if that's what he's talking about. If that's not what he's talking about, if he wants this committee to do it, then let us combine the two efforts from the Democratic side and the Republican side. Let's put them together. We've got nothing to be afraid of. And if Hillary Clinton or the Ukrainians were involved in trying to subvert our election process, I want to know about it.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, by all means.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The difference is that there is a special counsel appointed to investigate the elections last year. And there is not a special counsel appointed to investigate the alleged wrongdoings by one of the two candidates last year. And that is why members on this side of the aisle want to see some parity. So we're asking questions about an issue where there is no special counsel. And if there is a special counsel appointed, I will adhere to the same process that I adhered to when she was being investigated by the director of the FBI last year. We did not hold any hearings until he completed his investigation. And as you know, we're allowing the special counsel to do his job with regard to the Trump
Reclaiming my time, if I might, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if I'm allowed to.
That's the difference, and that's why this amendment has been offered.
Okay, well, but as the chairman well knows, the special counsel process is not one which we control. That's something that takes place within the Department of Justice.
I think that's the point of the special counsel. He's to do it without the political influence that we hope is not taking place.
Exactly.
And then we will receive the benefit of his investigation.
Well, perhaps I'm being dim-witted here, but I understand the objection to be that there's not a special counsel appointed to investigate Hillary Clinton and William Comey. How is that properly addressed to the Democrats on this panel?
The gentleman yield?
Yes.
I'd simply point out what's been said before, and what the chairman said a few months ago. The special counsel is to investigate crimes. Our oversight jurisdiction is to investigate the functioning of government and whether something should be done about it. And the fact that if you want to investigate what is in the amendment, wonderful, but it doesn't negate that we should investigate the things that were originally in the gentlelady's resolution, and the fact that there's a special counsel is for crimes and not for the general questions that we ought to investigate. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, again, I want to try to arrive at some common ground here. I take it that the position of the chair is that we have a special counsel who's operating to investigate the Russian undermining of our election and any potential collusion or conspiracy that took place, any potential coordination made illegal under the Federal Election Campaign Act and assorted crimes, okay? Now, could we all agree that the special counsel should not be dismissed by the President of the United States?
I think that is a separate issue beyond the scope of this discussion. And if the gentleman would yield, I'd point out that there are other committees, including the Intelligence Committee, investigating the underlying issue of whether or not Russia influenced our election. That is, many committees can, and some committees have, claimed jurisdiction to do that. It is my belief that this work should be conducted, and then reports should be given to the committee, and the committee should act in response to that. Now, that hasn't happened with regard to the matter with regard to the Clinton campaign, and therefore, we're asking in a letter for a special counsel, and until we get that, we're asking for information about it. If we get the special counsel, we don't need the information.
Well, if I could just complete then with this thought, it seems to me that if there's a serious effort being made to find out whether there was some kind of misconduct related to the Ukrainians or Hillary Clinton, fair enough, go for it if you think it's there. If all of this is simply meant to distract and divert from the ongoing special counsel investigation and somehow to create the idea of symmetry or parity, that strikes me as antithetical to the purposes of this committee. There's a special counsel who's at work, whose integrity, whose sovereignty in that investigation is being challenged every single day by the President of the United States, who seems to want to be either firing the Attorney General of the United States or isolating him or going after the special counsel. And I think our role should be to stand up for the special counsel rather than trying to further undermine what he's doing.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, by all means.
The gentleman's time has expired, but I appreciate him yielding to me. I just want to point out that, as was noted by the ranking member, we have requested that the special counsel meet with us in closed session so we can ascertain whether or not he is doing his job properly. And I think that's an appropriate function for us to do. But holding public hearings and inviting in witnesses that are also being interviewed by the special counsel and requesting documents that are also being examined by the special counsel is interference in that investigation, and I don't intend to participate in that.
Mr. Chairman, as Mr. Mueller responded to that, when can we have that hearing?
It's not a hearing.
Or when can we have that inquiry?
It is a meeting of myself and the ranking member with the special counsel.
Rest of us aren't invited?
He has not responded yet, but we're told that it will not be before we recess. So I can't tell you when it'll take place, but we're going to make sure it takes place.
Mr. Chairman, I have just a question on the point that you just raised.
If the gentleman whose time long ago expired would yield to you.
I will yield my negative time to the gentle lady from Washington.
I just had a question, Mr. Chairman, because you're saying that you think it would be interference for this committee to interview people, but are you saying then that the Senate Judiciary Committee is interfering by having the hearings that they are having? Because these hearings are taking place in the Senate Judiciary Committee because we do have jurisdiction and authority. And so all we're saying is the House Judiciary Committee is the only committee that does have jurisdiction.
That's not correct. There are other committees that have jurisdictions over parts of this.
That's true, but in terms of these
they're not acting
issues,
as well. But I will tell you that I do not believe that a sixth committee conducting hearings that could interfere with an investigation is better than 5 committees holding hearings that could interfere with an
but
investigation.
Mr. Chairman, you stated that this was interference, and I just want to make it clear that the Senate Judiciary Committee is continuing to look into these questions because they are important to the judiciary, to the Constitution, to our democracy. And that is what we were trying to get at. And I was willing to incorporate the other side's questions so that we could actually move forward. But it's not, this is something that the Senate Judiciary Committee has determined is well within the scope. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move strike last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was stated earlier by one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that President Clinton was impeached for having sex with a woman. And I think it's important, since we're the Judiciary Committee, that we're accurate about these things, and that's not accurate at all. Bill Clinton was impeached for perjury. That's why he was impeached. Now, it did have something to do with the fact that he had a history of sexual harassment of women. That's what this arose out of. I happened to be on this committee at the time. This happened in my second term quite a few years ago. And this committee did vote out articles of impeachment, which went to the House floor, and he was impeached by the House. And then I was one of the House managers in the trial of the president over on the Senate side. But what happened essentially is an American citizen, Paula Jones, one whom he had harassed, brought a lawsuit against him. And being a citizen and having the rights under our justice system to essentially protect her rights, her attorney had a deposition and asked the president, because that would be one of the things that one who is a plaintiff in a case like that would want to know, are there other women that he's harassed under him? And there were a number of them. And one of those happened to be an intern down at the White House, whose name is pretty famous now, Monica Lewinsky. And he lied about that, and he lied under oath about that. He put his hand on the Bible, he swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and he lied. And that's perjury. And there's a lot of people, in fact, hundreds all across the country, American citizens who are behind bars at that time, probably still are many, for committing perjury. And our view was that every person ought to be equal under the law, including the President of the United States. But that's why President Clinton was impeached, for perjury, not for the things that led up to that. Those things that led up to that were pretty unsavory. That type of behavior is inappropriate, whether it's in a hotel room in Arkansas or whether it's in the White House. It may not be illegal, but it's certainly unsavory and wrong.
Would the gentleman yield?
And that's why he was impeached. It was for perjury. I'd be happy to yield.
Well, thank you. I recall the Whitewater investigation in Ken Starr, 40 investigators, 40 lawyers, $40 million over 4 years, investigating Whitewater, Vince Foster, other Travelgate, I mean, a bunch of stuff, and all they could come up with was a stain on a dress. But this committee, at this time, is refusing to take any kind of action.
Reclaiming my time, the stain that you mentioned, I had mentioned that, but that was actual physical proof that what was said was true, not what the president said was true, but what the accusations were true. And I would
This
also
committee
note,
has more than a
my
soiled
time.
dress
The
in
gentleman
front
will
of it.
suspend. It's the time of the gentleman from Ohio.
I would also note that even though the Senate voted 50-50 to remove him from office, and obviously it wasn't just one vote away because it takes a 2/3. Our founding fathers made it very difficult to remove a president from office. I would also note that after that, the Bar Association disbarred him. They took away his license to practice law. He was fined something like $500,000. There were settlements with a number of the women involved here, but there's no question that that president did do things which shouldn't occur in this country, and he was held at least somewhat accountable for that.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Well, I wish that this committee would pay as much attention to what's going on now as it did to what was happening with Bill Clinton. And with that, I'll yield back to you.
Well, and again, reclaiming my time, there has to be a crime in order for something like that to happen, or high crimes and misdemeanors, or an impeachable offense, or something along those lines.
Would the gentleman yield?
And just one other thing, somebody also mentioned pardons earlier in this thing. I remember asking the question of one of the attorneys, I believe it was, and the state as to whether they would consider, would the president forego pardoning himself, and the answer was in the affirmative at that time, but and my time has expired.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
For purposes of the gentleman from Rhode Island, seek recognition.
I move to strike the last
Gentleman
word.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, 6 months ago, President Donald Trump was inaugurated. The Judiciary Committee's oversight function has all but come to a standstill, and now it's in a full-fledged farcical mode. Evidence has been mounting of conflicts of interest, of ongoing ties to foreign governments, of potential constitutional crises. Democratic members of this committee have written letters urging immediate hearings on the actions of this administration, but our requests have gone unanswered. Our committee has even voted 3 times along party lines to decline to request documents related to pressing matters, including the president's wiretapping claims, potential violations of the Emoluments Clause, and troubling contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials. This committee has failed to take action at every opportunity, despite the 3-alarm fire happening right in front of our eyes. Let's look at what just happened in this past month. The president has repeatedly undermined the credibility of top Justice Department officials, including the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, and the FBI Director. The president has openly suggested both the possibility of firing Special Counsel Robert Mueller and pardoning himself and his family. It was revealed that during the 2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner met with a person described as a Russian government attorney and a former Russian military intelligence officer. Donald Trump Jr. agreed to the meeting after being promised incriminating information about Hillary Clinton, which had been collected as part of a Russian government effort to aid his father's candidacy. Intercepts by U.S. intelligence agencies showed that then Senator Sessions may have discussed the Trump campaign during his meeting with Russia's ambassador. It also came to light that the Attorney General did not disclose these meetings on his security clearance application, security clearance which he still currently holds. Throughout all of this, the Judiciary Committee has stood idly by. We're reaching the point where this Congress is willfully denying the American people the opportunity to learn the truth. I'm sure my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would agree that in carrying out our oversight function, the first step is an honest attempt to get the facts. And what was originally presented as a resolution from Ms. Jayapal and myself was a tool to help us get to the bottom of still unanswered questions. The full extent of the ties between Donald Trump's inner circle and the Kremlin, whether James Comey was fired to hide the truth about Donald Trump's ties to Russia or collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian officials, and if Jeff Sessions violated his recusal when he participated in the firing of James Comey. We've crossed into unprecedented territory, and I fear that we are witnessing a tipping point in our nation's history that is unlike anything we've ever seen before in American politics. Our committee can and must exercise our authority to act as a check on the executive branch. Instead, this committee, in this very clever procedural maneuver is attempting to shift the attention to, oh yes, their favorite subject, Hillary Clinton. These ongoing investigations have nothing to do with Hillary Clinton. And the American people cannot be so easily fooled. No matter the evidence of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, or collusion with the Russian government, will the refrain always be Hillary Clinton and some reference to her? Will our colleagues refuse to engage in any meaningful oversight and continue to hide behind this phony argument in the hopes that the American people will grow numb to all of this alarming evidence? Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, history will judge us very harshly if we continue to refuse to do our duty and get to the bottom of this. You think about the men and women who have given their lives in defense of our democracy, the men and women who serve in the armed forces, who risk their lives to defend this great democracy. We owe it to them to honor their service by doing our part to defend our democracy as well. And I am deeply saddened that a serious effort to help this committee collect the facts so that we can follow them where they will lead and get to the bottom of this has turned into an opportunity for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to make a mockery of the seriousness of these allegations by talking about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and refusing to look at all of the evidence of all of this misconduct, potential collusion, deep conflicts of interest, and obstruction of justice that imperil our democracy. And with that, I yield back.
The question occurs on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute offered by the gentleman from Florida. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Recorded vote, Mr.
Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Franks?
Aye.
Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Poe? Mr. Marino?
Yes.
Mr. Marino votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Mr. Collins? Mr. DeSantis? Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby?
I don't think that recommendation.
Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Rutherford?
Aye.
Mr. Rutherford votes aye. Ms. Handel? Ms. Handel votes yes. Mr. Conyers?
No.
Mr. Conyers votes no. Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Gutierrez? No. Mr. Gutierrez votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Oh, Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? No. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Snyder? Mr. Snyder votes no.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
Has every member who wishes to vote voted? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 16 members voted aye, 13 members voted no.
And the amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute is adopted. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? The question is on,
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
what, the gentleman will state her
My
parliamentary.
parliamentary inquiry is, what is the impact of this resolution passing? The underlying,
I think that's not a parliamentary inquiry. The bill speaks for itself. The amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is before the committee, and the vote occurs on it now.
well, Mr. Chairman, you know, the impact is that it will come back to us, it will go to the floor. We're getting a special counsel, because I tried to read it and I didn't see that action item. And then I wondered, for those of us who desire to file an impeachment inquiry for the untruth that the President of the United States has now been engaged in, denying that he fired Mr. Comey for anything other than his misbehavior, as opposed to the Russian thing, will we also be able to file an impeachment inquiry?
The gentlewoman is not stating a parliamentary inquiry.
Well, I want to know, if we pass this, does that mean that we can also have before the committee an impeachment inquiry of Mr. Trump?
The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended to House Resolution 446.
I hope that will
All
open the
those
door
in
for an
favor will
impeachment
respond
inquiry.
by saying
I yield
aye.
back.
Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. A reporting quorum. Oh, I'm sorry.
We have a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman. No, okay, never mind.
Mr. Chairman,
Where's the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report the resolution favorably to the House.
The question, a reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report House Resolution 446 as amended favorably to the House. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the resolution is ordered reported favorably. A recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Aye. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. King? Mr. Franks?
Aye.
Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Poe? Mr. Marino?
Yes.
Mr. Marino votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Labrador?
Yes.
Mr. Labrador votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Mr. Collins? Mr. DeSantis? Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes yes. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford votes aye. Ms. Handel? Ms. Handel votes yes. Mr. Conyers?
No.
Mr. Conyers votes no. Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Mr. Gutierrez? Mr. Gutierrez votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Snyder? Mr. Snyder votes no.
The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Bass.
Ms. Bass votes no.
I recorded.
The gentlewoman is recorded as a no.
Thank you. I'm sorry. What's the
Has every member voted who wishes to vote?
Is that the one down at the, is that the one down at the end of the corner? Is that the,
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 15 members voted aye, 13 members voted no.
The ayes have it, and the resolution as amended is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the resolution will be reported as a single member in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business for today, and thanks to all our members for attending. The markup is adjourned.